say we appreciate the opportunity to have members of council, as well as staff and citizens, look at how we are working as a county to address our funding options by attending these workshops and getting a better understanding of some of the challenges as well as some of the opportunities that we have associated with our budgeting mechanisms. And so what we want to do today is continue in our series, and we're going to have our Assistant County Administrator, Lori Thomas, talk to us about our special revenue funds, which are one of the many funds that the county has. So with that being said, I'm going to take off my video. I'm going to ask Ms. Thomas to go ahead and pick up. And again, welcome to all the council members who have joined. And we look forward to an opportunity to share with you information about special revenue funds. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Brown. I'm going to share my screen now, so if you'll bear with me just one moment. Can you see the screen now?
Yes.
Great, thank you very much. So thank you all again for being with us this afternoon. This is being recorded, and we will share this with council and anyone else who's interested in following. So we're going to talk today about special revenue funds. Today's format will be the same format that we've had for all other of these presentations. Basically, we're going to just be providing information to you. It's very interactive. So if you have a question along the way, please feel free to ask. Additionally, we're very flexible. So if we move forward and something that we say at that point brings up a question from a previous issue, please feel free to ask us to step back, and we'll be happy to do that as well. Special revenue funds are a little bit different from our general fund and our enterprise fund. So I don't anticipate that this session will last quite as long as some of the others have. So thank you again for joining us, and we appreciate it. Again, I think you all have seen this now, at least many of you may have seen it for about 5 times. It just talks about what our budgeting best practices are. And with special revenue funds, they're no different than any other fund that we actually have in our arsenal of funds, or in our conglomeration of funds that we have here at the county. The only difference for special revenue funds is that they are earmarked, and we'll talk about that as well. We're also trying to achieve a structurally balanced budget, as we've said in the past as well, is that we're trying to match recurring revenues with recurring expenses. And whatever's left over from those are typically called reserves. It's always a good idea to have reserves, because reserves help to fund future projects. It helps you to set aside money for things that you may not be afford to do all in one year. And it also helps you to be prepared to adapt in the instance of having an economic downturn or a pandemic, as we've seen. So what are special revenue funds? Special revenue funds are an account established by a government to collect money that must be used for a special project. Now, project has a lot of different definitions. It can be one specific task, or it could be a project that has an overarching goal associated with it that have multiple tasks that will ensue for longer periods of time. So most of ours are those that have tasks that will ensue for a longer period of time. The good thing about a special revenue fund is that because you're using the funds for one specific group or type of expenditure, you do typically have an extra level of accountability and transparency so the taxpayers know what dollars are going in and what they're being used for. In GASB 54, which was adopted in 2011, it clarified the definition of a special revenue fund, and it said that they were used to account for and report the proceeds of specific revenue sources that are restricted and committed to expenditures for specified purposes. So when you look at the fund balance that's remaining after you pay all of your expenditures for a given year, if there are leftover funds, they are earmarked. You will never find them when we do consolidated financial reports for the government as a whole. You would never find them in the unassigned fund balance. They're always going to either be committed or assigned. So with that, James, Hayes, if you would, I'm going to ask him to take it away and talk a little bit about Richland County's special revenue funds in particular.
Okay. Yeah. Can you hear me? I just got on, Laura. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can.
Okay. Yeah. So we have different special revenue funds that are highlighted here on the screen. They range from the emergency telephone all the way down to the economic development. I'll just talk a little bit about each one of them. Emergency telephone, of course, is the funds that are set aside to account for the E911 system that we run jointly with the City of Columbia. Of course, we have Richland County Fire Services that we also run in conjunction with the City of Columbia, which is Richland County City of Columbia Fire District. Of course, there's the School Resource Officer, or SRO for short, which is also partially funded by the general fund. We have some schools. We have 3 school districts: Richland 1, Richland 2, Lexington Richland 5, and then there's there's a Heathwood Academy that also provides funding for the SRO budget, but also, again, like I said, it is supplemented by the general fund. There's the public defender, which of course is used for funding the individuals who need lawyer services that are provided by the public. As the screen said, legal assistance to those who cannot afford it. There's the victims' rights. There's forfeiture, temporary alcohol permits, tourism development. Some of the 2 bigger ones, H-tax and accommodations taxes. We have stormwater, which is funded by property tax millage. We have Conservation Commission, which is also funded by $500,000. Neighborhood redevelopment is funded by $500,000. Road maintenance is funded by the road maintenance fees from the cars still. And then there's also okay, we're gonna go a little bit fast. Okay, then there's also, of course, transportation, and then economic development. Okay, there you go. That's it, Lauren. Funding sources. So we'll talk a little bit about the funding sources for E911. Has we get some state funding through the 911 tariff, but it also has 2 transfers in. The general fund supports it, but it also gets funding from the fire services budget. So it has 2 transfers in, but we also normally budget about roughly $1.2 million in revenue between state aid and the 911 tariff. The rest of the funding comes from funds from the general fund and then funds from the fire services budget. Fire services has 2 primary funding sources. The main one, of course, there's a millage on the tax bill, but there's also roughly about $2.4 million that's budgeted in a water assessments that appear on the City of Columbia water bills. Of course, school resource officers, I mentioned, they're partially funded by the schools themselves, but also the general fund does support it. The public defender has roughly about $1.6 million annually that we get from the state. I think I see somebody's hand.
Yes, thank you, Mr. Hayes. When it comes to the millage and the tax rates that we pay, different parts of the county pay different amounts for certain services and things that we fund. For the fire service, does every part of Richland County pay the same amount?
Right. So the millage, right. So in that the fire services millage is on the tax bill for those regions that are outside the City of Columbia, because the city has its own fire services. So it's it's the same millage. That millage is the same for each tax district in which it's applicable to. So with the millage, so you're correct. Not every tax district pays the same millage, because not every tax district has the same item. But if a tax district does have fire services applicable to it, which is mostly, again, countywide, I have to go look at, I'm putting my auditor's hat back on. But any tax district that in which fire services, and I think these are outside of the city, they pay that exact same millage.
Thank you, sir.
Okay, so again, going back to public defender, the public defender's annual amount as provided by the state is normally about $1.6 million. The county's portion has increased drastically over the last few years. So I think right now it's roughly about 3.5 million transferring in from the general fund to support the public defender's office. Victims' rights is, of course, normally that was stabilized at about 686,000, but due to a request from the sheriff department earlier, that number went up slightly this year. And forfeiture is, again, those are state and federal funding from drug busts through the sheriff's office. And then temporary alcohol permits is coming strictly from state funding. Any questions before we go to the next slide? So some of the other funding sources, tourism development, now that is our local ATAX. You have ATAX, the accommodation tax, the state tax that supports our ATAX fund. The tourism development is also an ATAX fund, but it's the state allows municipalities and counties to also enact a local ATAX. So that's the local ATAX that's accounted for separately from our state ATAX. And these funds are used to pay for the debt service on the Columbia Convention Center. So that's the difference between the tourism development and ATAX. Both of them are ATAX funding sources, which is one that's state funded, which is our regular ATAX, and the other one is our local ATAX that is used to pay the debt on the convention center. Of course, H-tax is the special 2-cent tax on all prepared food and beverage in the county. A-tax we just mentioned, there's a special tax on lodging. That's the state portion that we use to support our tourism for A-tax related activities. Stormwater is supported by special millage, and that goes back to what Ms. Newton was saying. It's applicable to those tax districts in which the county auditor puts that millage on. So not every tax district has the stormwater millage on it, but for those tax districts that do, it is the same millage. The conservation mission is that's countywide. Every tax district pays their $500,000. Same thing with the neighborhood redevelopment. And then road maintenance is, of course, the fee that's assessed on the motorized vehicles in the county. And of course, the mass transit and transportation is supported by the penny tax. Now, the mass transit amount, just to be specific, those are the funds that are funded in the county from the penny tax. They go to support the CMRTA or whatever the name is at the moment. So that's where that's coming from. And then, of course, the economic development is supported. It has two primary funding sources. It has the $500,000 from the general fund that the council passed, I think it was back in 2015, but also they get funding from the multi-county industrial park. There's in that codified ordinance of the park, they're allowed to get, I want to say 7% of the fee and lieu for that park. Those go to support the economic development fund. And I can answer any question the council may have.
Thank you, James. As I said when we began this one, this presentation is relatively short because special revenue funds, until you start getting into the specifics of them, are very generalized, and the specifics of the uses are very restricted. So there's not a lot of flexibility with funding in those particular pots of money, if you will. One thing to note too on hospitality tax is a significant fund, and we do get a transfer from the hospitality tax to support the general fund as well. That's supported by South Carolina state statute. So that is all we have today, but are there any, before we end, are there any questions that any of you may have? Mr. Brown, I'll turn it back over to you.
Yeah, several members of council were able to join, so I just did want to just say thank you to each of you again. And as we continue to go through these workshops, and we look at items such as special revenue, while many of these items that you've heard have inflows to the county, some of these are strongly supported by general fund dollars. And so when we look at all these things in totality, it will help you get a better picture of some of the decisions that we have to make concerning the budget. So hopefully this information has been generally helpful as we prepare to look at the budget as a whole, but at the same time, give you some insight as to different funding mechanisms that we have to address concerning items that are coming in, as well as items that are going out to the general fund. So again, thank you, members of council. And again, before we break from this session, we'll open up the floor for any final questions or comments from members of council.
Mr. Brown, I believe Ms. Newton has her hand raised.
Okay, Ms. Newton.
Thank you, Mr. Brown, and thank you for the last comments that you made. I know that Mr. Hayes and Ms. Brown mentioned it in some cases in terms of the special revenue funds that are heavily supported by the general fund, but could someone just take a moment and review what some of those are for some extra context?
Sure. So we'll just ask Mr. Hayes if you could just talk about those funds that are both receiving revenues, but then are also receiving funding from the general fund, please. Are you still with me, Mr. Hayes?
Mr. Brown, if he's not, I think I can speak to it.
Okay, go ahead, Lori.
Okay. One of those funds is the emergency telephone fund. That is the E911. We do contribute, I believe last year it was about $1.2 million to that fund. Currently, we actually transfer most of those funds. We transfer those funds pretty much entirely to the city of Columbia to subsidize, or actually not to subsidize, but to support the E911 center that they currently run. Again, that the plan long-term for that is that the county may assume operations of that. School resource officers, this is an arrangement that we typically have with several of the school districts where we actually do provide school resource officers. The school districts pick up a portion of it, typically between 70 and 75%, and the county pays the difference on that. Public defender. The public defender is an office that we have to have because of a state mandate. However, over the years, as with many state requirements that say that counties have to support these efforts, the funding has begun to slip, and we do provide general funds to support that as well. Lastly is victims' rights. Again, same thing that happened with public defender, only on a larger scale. As we see more victims of crime in the community, the services have grown, but yet the funds from the state to support that have shrunk dramatically. So the general fund does support that. I believe that's all of the funds. Like I said, the one that does transfer money back to the county is the hospitality tax money, and that is by state statute. Did that answer your question, Ms. Newton?
It does. And I have another question, but I'm trying to think of the best way to word it. Obviously, all of these services are services that we want to provide. I guess you addressed part of my question. I'm wondering, in the cases where we are supplementing from the general fund, are we supplementing because, yes, it's the right thing to do and it reflects our priorities? Or are we also supplementing because state law says that we have to fund them to some level that may be more than those funds would naturally pull in? Does my question make sense, Ms.?
Yes, ma'am, it does.
Thank you.
With respect from the public defender and victims' rights, we actually have to fund those we have to support those or provide those. Let me change the way I'm answering this. We have to provide those by state mandate. The degree to which we supplement it, we may have some flexibility with, but I would need to delve more into that to tell you how much flexibility, if that answers your question.
It does. And I guess my follow-up question on that would be, there are many cases where our budget reflects something that we are mandated to do that the state sometimes supports and sometimes doesn't support. And so outside of what you just said, are there any other items on this list that represent a state mandate that is not necessarily funded by the state?
I don't believe so. What I will say is there are some component costs within some of our other funds that are not necessarily special revenue funds where we have to provide services. But what the state funds or supports is not in line with the cost associated. I'll give you a good brand. I won't say it's good, but I'll give you an example. And I know that Chris Cowan is on, so if I say something wrong, Chris, you might have to jump in there and correct me on this. When detainees are at our detention center, if they are released by pardon and parole and they have to wear a monitor, it used to be that those costs were absorbed by the court system. We now have to absorb those costs. So that is a cost of about $800,000 to the county, although really the one thing that we did was just housed the detainee. So that's one example of a cost that it's sort of been handed back to the counties, but it really isn't associated with county business, if that makes sense.
It does.
And some of the things within the court systems and the solicitor's office and things of that nature as well, their costs continue to grow and state funds there continue to shrink as well.
Thank you.
No problem. Thank you. Mr. Brown?
All right, hearing no additional questions, again, I'll give just a few moments for any member that may have any final remarks or questions before we close out the session. Again, we will have future opportunities. So for those who are watching this budget workshop, this optional workshop that we provided, as well as the future ones that we will have, we want to thank you for your participation and look forward to sharing some additional information with you as we go forward with our budget process this year. Thank you again to members of council. Thank you to members of staff. We're going to go ahead and conclude this meeting by signing off on this Zoom call. Thank you.